Good afternoon. On behalf of the Center for Community Progress, I'd like to welcome you to today's Cornerstone webinar. My name is Justin Goddard, and I serve as the Program Officer for National Leadership in Education here at Community Progress. Cornerstone is our webinar series which equips participants with the building blocks to understand and solve tough challenges related to property vacancy, abandonment, and deterioration. This webinar in particular is part of our presentation series focused on COVID-19 related community response and recovery. For today's Cornerstone, we are joined by Alan Mallach, who serves as a senior fellow here at Community Progress. Alan is nationally known for his work on housing, economic development, urban revitalization, and has worked with local governments and community organizations across the country to develop creative policies and strategies to rebuild their cities and neighborhoods. Before turning it over to Alan, I want to mention that we will allow time at the end of the presentation to answer questions. If you have a question during the presentation, please type it into the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your browser and send it to both the webinar host and all panelists. If you experience any technical difficulties, please use the chat box to message the Community Progress host or send an email to Justin Goddard at jgoddard@communityprogress.net. Finally, Community Progress has created a COVID-19 resource center, which provides resources and weekly updates for neighborhoods looking to prevent vacancy, abandonment, and deterioration related to the current economic and health challenges. And with that, I will turn it over to Alan.
Well, good morning or afternoon, as the case may be. And this is going to be a very difficult subject to talk about because we know that at some point we're going to be able to start walking around again. Businesses will be allowed to reopen. Travel will resume in some fashion to some extent. We don't know how long that'll be. We don't know what limitations we'll be under. Another thing that's incredibly important is that we don't know whether there will be a recurrence of COVID-19 after we resume some form of normality, but before there's a successful vaccine. And even more so, we don't know what the federal government will end up doing, how extensive their support will be for communities, local governments, state governments, and everybody else affected by it, or how effective and well-targeted it will be. So far, the results are mixed. In addition, we don't know how severe, basically overall, the impacts are going to be, or how effectively the federal government will respond. But, and this is the point of the webinar, we can anticipate a lot of things and start to put together a picture of what we have to look at, what we have to watch out for, what we have to start planning for. And I think that's the critical issue. How do we start thinking about what is likely to happen in our neighborhoods, in particularly urban middle neighborhoods, which, as I'll get into, are among the most vulnerable for major impacts. So I'm going to walk through a bunch of impacts, a bunch of things that are likely to happen to some degree as a result of the pandemic, then what the impacts are likely to be on neighborhoods and middle neighborhoods in particular, and then try to tie it up. I'm not going to offer any answers because I don't have answers, but I do have what I hope are the right questions. And then hopefully in the Q&A, we can start a dialogue about what some of the answers might look like. Okay, first thing, and I've got to admit, I made this chart about a week ago, and the data that came out this morning about claims suggests we may have to revise this upward. In fact, some experts think we are already at the 20% level of unemployment, or very close to it. So we may end up with unemployment above 20% by the time it peaks, which is likely to be And again, this hinges on how long we're going to be in quarantine. It's likely to be either in the summer or possibly early fall. So that is going to be, by itself, utterly devastating. A second issue, which is critical, most states and the federal government have some form of moratorium on evictions in place. Not all of them, but most. In some cases, it's a pure kind of de facto moratorium because the courts are closed, they're not taking filings, but there's no formal moratorium and no limit on what might happen the moment they reopen. In other states like New Jersey, there's a formal moratorium by executive order, which provides that it lasts a minimum of 60 days after the stay-at-home orders are lifted and the courts are back in business. So it's a completely mixed bag. But the fact is, there's going to be a great deal of non-payment of rent between now and, say, the fall. The big question is, how will landlords respond by instituting a wave of evictions, even though the notion of kicking out millions of tenants and having millions of empty apartments at a point where the economy is in deep trouble does not seem like a rational response. But will they evict in large scale? Will there be some form of assistance from the federal government? And what can local government do? And one of the big questions is, will local governments use some of their additional CDBG and ESG money to address this issue, and if so, how? Second issue, mortgages. The same issues are affecting homeowners and property owners that affect tenants. The inability to pay. The federal government has instituted a mortgage forbearance. But again, at some point, that's going to be lifted, and then what happens? Are lenders going to tack the arrears onto the back of the mortgage, or are they going to call them due immediately? And again, what kind of assistance may be provided? Another big one. I would guess the majority of small businesses in the United States are currently closed. Will they be able to reopen? Which ones will be able to reopen? What types of businesses? In what locations? And again, there's a real risk that many businesses will simply not have the financial resources to reopen. Home sales. House showings are not perfect, but a pretty good leading indicator of sales a few months later. And as the chart shows, this happens to be New Jersey, but there is data for each state, and it varies. In some cases, the drop is as little as 40%. In some cases, it's over 90%. In New Jersey, as the chart shows, the number of real estate showings, even though under the executive order they are permitted, they've dropped by 72% from the comparable period in 2019. So we are looking at, certainly, for some length of time, a significant drop in house sales. And the big question is this going to turn into a comparable drop in house values and residential stability? Again, we don't know, but this is a very significant risk. A big issue, which is tied into all of these factors, is how will they affect consumer spending, which ultimately goes to what extent are small businesses, restaurants, boutiques, coffee shops, bodegas, and so forth, going to be able to see a resumption of business. And especially in communities that are dependent on conferences, conventions, tourism, entertainment, and all of these kinds of things. and this includes a lot of America's major cities. To what extent are these activities going to resume, and the employment and the income that they generate going to start to flow again? Again, we don't know, but it's likely to be a very slow process. This is a huge impact. Local government and state government are, frankly, being clobbered. The most recent projections are that in the fiscal year that starts July 1, state governments will see the largest shortfall in revenues, basically from one year to the next, ever. Significantly worse than the worst year of the Great Recession. I mean, depending on what their revenue sources are, state governments are looking at huge shortfalls. City governments are looking at huge shortfalls. In the case of cities that are dependent on the property tax, the shortfall may be more gradual and possibly more limited depending on how quick the recovery is. A city that's dependent on sales tax or wage tax is going to see a dramatic immediate shortfall. Detroit, which is heavily dependent on wage tax and casino taxes, is projecting a budget shortfall of over 20% for the coming fiscal year. And again, what is going to be cut? Is it going to be state aid to municipalities and school districts? Is it going to be social services? We don't know. Another issue, will banks become more risk averse? What is going to happen to non-bank lenders who are dealing with mortgage arrearages and unable to make their payments to their investors? Okay, so one big question is, what kind of recovery are we looking at? And how long is this going to go on? Now, obviously, nobody really knows. But what I did here is I came up with 4 scenarios that are at least possible, and then I layered a recent projection by the National Bureau of Economic Research on this. I mean, this all assumes that we treat January 2020 as kind of a benchmark for the economy. And then, as you can see, we are seeing a dramatic decline in economic activity, roughly twice what was experienced in the Great Recession, and obviously taking place a lot faster. Now, at some point, this is going to bottom out, and things are going to start going up again. And then there are big issues. The first one is, when is it going to bottom out? Now, in my projections, I assumed that it would bottom out in midsummer. The NBER doesn't expect it to bottom out until the end of the year. But either way, then it's going to come up. Now, then you have the 2 big issues at that point are, how strong will the recovery be, and will there be a recurrence? Because I think a lot of people are looking at what somebody has dubbed a double dip recession. In other words, it bottoms out, it starts to work its way up again, and then when the virus comes back, especially as some people believe may happen, it's joined by the flu season this coming winter. Then you'll see it drop again until it bottoms out at a lower level and then starts picking up again. And the strength of the recovery is going to be very powerfully impacted by how strong and how effective the federal response is, because ultimately they're the only people who have the deep pockets and the ability to essentially do unlimited borrowing to try to stabilize the situation and foster a speedy recovery. Nobody else is capable of doing that. Now, what this says is, okay, best case, we're not going to be back to our January 2020 point until the beginning of 2022. That's the best case. The more realistic cases, especially if it's a double dip, project the recovery to be much slower and unlikely to see daylight until 2023 or perhaps even later. So obviously, we don't know the course of the recovery, and we can hope it's going to be a speedy one. But what this means is whatever the impacts are going to be, we can't assume that there's going to be a sudden, drastic, fast reversal of the course. We're going to have to plan on addressing these impacts over an extended period of a minimum, I would say, of a year and a half and possibly longer. So that's the overall picture of those are things that are all likely to some significant degree. Now, the problem, of course, is that not everybody's going to be hit equally hard. Certain economic sectors, certain geographic areas, certain demographic groups, and so forth are going to be hit harder than others. We live in a country, as we all know, of huge inequalities between people of different economic levels, educational levels, racial and ethnic makeup, and geography. And these are all going to have a bearing on how hard or how light a community gets off. Now, when we look at middle neighborhoods, we see they have a number of key characteristics, all of which are likely to make them particularly impacted by the risks that I've just laid out. Now, this is not true of all middle neighborhoods. It's particularly true of those in urban centers. It's particularly true of those in the Northeast and Midwest. But it's true to some degree across the board. First, more or less by definition, they are predominantly made up of working class, lower middle class households who have a very large share of blue collar and service jobs, including retail, warehousing, healthcare, and the like, which means that this is a population that is disproportionately susceptible, on the one hand, to exposure to the coronavirus, on the other hand, to unemployment. So we're likely to see a lot of the effects exacerbated for that reason. Secondly, from a housing market standpoint, middle neighborhoods have seen, in many cases, significant loss of home ownership during the past 10 to 15 years, and relatively low property values, in some cases by comparison to the rest of the city, in many cases by comparison to the rest of the region or national levels. So again, they're disproportionately susceptible to housing market shocks, such as recurrent foreclosures, rental arrearages, evictions, and loss of sales demand. Third, they tend to have usually not terribly vibrant small business sectors. They tend to be, a lot of businesses are not well capitalized, do not have reserves, may not have the ability to withstand the period of economic loss. And of course, what we're seeing is that an awful lot of the small businesses, especially those that do not have lawyers, accountants, and other people, banking relationships, and so forth, will have and are having great difficulty accessing even the resources that are supposed to be coming out to help them. And then finally, middle neighborhoods tend to be very heavily dependent on public sector services, whether it's policing, parks, recreation, sanitation, social services, public education, and so forth. All of the services that are at risk of significant cuts because of the fiscal constraints. Okay, so just walking through this, they will be disproportionately impacted by the economic strains. They tend to have large numbers of vulnerable tenant households with high cost burdens, and typically the rental stock in middle neighborhoods is owned by small landlords, many of whom are vulnerable themselves and may have financial difficulty by virtue of the fact they may not be collecting rent. And a lot of the rental housing stock, especially single-family stock, tends to be old and often in need of repair and upgrading. So the rental arrears could put severe pressure both on landlords and on the physical condition of the housing stock. Again, most of the buyers are not wealthy households. Most of the people who've bought houses in these neighborhoods in the last 15 years are not wealthy people. They're people who are moderate income, often financially strapped, again, have very little of a cushion and are at risk of foreclosure. And again, as far as home buying is concerned, many middle neighborhoods, and particularly African-American middle neighborhoods, had weak home buying markets before the crisis. Now, that's likely to be further depressed. And that, of course, will mean that you have risks of abandonment, risks of more units perhaps going from owner occupancy to rental ownership. Credit access, it's the same issue. If lenders, because of just the uncertainties of the market and the economic conditions following the pandemic, start becoming more risk averse, that is going to disproportionately impact areas which had limited credit access to begin with. And then finally, cutbacks in municipal services are going to be devastating because of the need for these services in these neighborhoods. And one area that I think is going to be heavily at risk of cuts will be code enforcement, particularly at a point when it is most needed. So, to sum up, now I realize this is probably a little hard to read, but I think you can probably decipher it on your screens. What I've tried to do here is kind of tie the pieces together in a sense. How each of these different factors is likely to affect the neighborhoods and what possible outcomes may come of it. So, for example, to the extent that if you have accumulated rent arrears, that could lead, and again, I don't know that it will, but it could easily lead to significant increases in evictions, which in turn could lead to greater homelessness. It could result, because landlords have less money to spend, deferred maintenance, reduced repairs, reduced services, affecting the health and safety of tenants. It could lead to landlords defaulting on their mortgages or simply deciding that they can't make any money from this property anymore and walking away, as we know happened in the past, which could increase vacancy, abandonment, and foreclosures. So that's an example. The other boxes here follow the same track. The point is that ultimately, all of these factors are putting neighborhood stability significantly at risk. Now, in the end, I don't know, nobody knows how intense this is going to be, to what extent it's going to overwhelm neighborhoods or to what extent it's going to be manageable. But I think by laying it out and by people understanding this combination of impacts that is likely to affect these neighborhoods, this is a good time to start planning. And a good time to also start, I would say, figuring out how to get good and real-time information. And so one thing, and in fact, I hope to work on this in the next couple of weeks and perhaps have some kind of thing we can share, is what kind of data can people at the neighborhood level start to gather to get a handle on, for example, how many tenants are actually not paying their rent? How many mortgages are actually potentially going into default? How many sales are there compared to a year ago? How are municipalities cutting their budget? How many small businesses are closed and things of that sort? So I think planning, working with local governments, state governments, community organizations to figure out, are there things one can do in anticipation of some of these problems? Can the city, for example, use some of the money coming in through CDBG and ESG to create some kind of an emergency program to help address the rental issue, whether it's through tenant assistance or assistance to landlords who are in financial hardship because their tenants didn't pay rent? There are a lot of issues that this is the time to start talking about them and thinking about them and figuring out where money might be available to address some of them that needs to be done if we're going to be ready to start tackling these things when they're on top of us, which could be in a few months. So with that, I thank you for your attention. And at this point, I'll be happy to try to answer any questions you might have. So, Justin, if you're about.
Hey, Alan. Alan, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Are we going to get some questions?
Yeah, they should be in the Q&A box.
I'm trying to open up my, oh, there we go. Yeah, okay, gotcha. I see it. Yeah. Okay. I haven't seen any yet. I see a shout out to you from Nicole.
Interesting. Give me 1 second to look into what's going on. I think what I'm going to do then is, if you're comfortable, can I read you some of the questions that have come in?
Oh, of course.
Okay. Let me scroll to the top. So the first question says.
Oh, wait a second. What I realized is I needed to scroll down. Okay. Sorry. Yeah. Okay.
No problem.
Okay. The first question is there a way I can look at all of the questions at the same time, or do I have to just look at them one at a time?
The only thing that you can do is just sort of scroll through. The other thing that you can potentially do is minimize the other menus on the side of your browser.
Good idea, yeah. Oh, that's a good idea. That helps. That helps a lot. Helps a little. Okay. Okay, the first question, I guess this is from a city, talks about the scale of the the scale of the utilities and contract rent payments relative to the amount of money received in CDBG and ESG. And it's not a lot of money compared to the potential problem. But I think one important issue to bear in mind is that not everybody is going to be struggling as much. And to some extent, I think it's important when the city realizes what resources it has to address this problem to figure out how to make sure it hits the people who have the greatest need for it. So fortunately, with the supplemental unemployment payments that are coming from the federal government, at least for the next few months, a significant number, we don't know whether it's half or 2/3 or what, but a significant number of the people who have lost their jobs are going to have income replacement that's at least roughly comparable to, in some cases even better, than the income they were making all along. And presumably most of those people are going to be paying rent out of that money. So the problem is not going to be something that affects all renters or even all unemployed renters, at least initially. So I think what the city has to do as it designs a program is develop a set of pretty straightforward criteria so that they can identify the people who need the resources most, so that at least initially, while the resources are clearly limited, it can use those resources most effectively. Okay, this is really the toughest neighborhood question. This is from Marshal, Netherlands. What can we do now to get in front of these likely crises in neighborhoods and try for a softer landing? Well, I think there are a couple of things, and they're all limited because, again, there are just too many unknowns as of yet. The first thing is to start figuring out how to get more information about the magnitude and the nature of the problems that are starting to emerge in your individual neighborhood. And the second is, I think, trying to start getting a handle on some of the things which can be anticipated where you might be able to influence the environment. And one of those, for example, is the question of rental. Again, it's not that there's a solution out there, but there are some resources that may be able to be used. As I was just saying, it may be possible to identify the most serious cases. It may be possible also to reach out to, I think here's a simple thing, reach out to the landlord community, which tends to be, at least not entirely, but heavily local, and just point out the sheer stupidity, if nothing else, of doing large-scale evictions of people who were reliable rent payers before the crisis at a point when the market is basically in the tank, and suggesting that even if they're hurting, it makes more sense for them to cut the tenant slack and work with the tenant over time rather than evict the tenant and start fresh. I mean, I don't think that's a difficult message to convey, and I don't think it'll be hard for people to grasp it, but I think there's something about the eviction being a default setting for a lot of landlords that has to be fought. So I think there are a variety of small things. The other thing is to try to identify the people who are impacted, the unemployed people, people who have had to close their businesses and may have difficulty opening them, and try to figure out how a CDC or a local government or anybody can help maximize their access to whatever services, assistance, help, support might be out there. Because I think there are a variety of things emerging, but a lot of them, like the small business program and the PPP, have been difficult for small, unsophisticated businesses and individuals to get access to. Another thing is to reach out to lenders and as well as public agencies and actively lobby where there are mortgage arrears to get those put back to the end of the mortgage rather than hold people liable for the arrears immediately. Simply getting that commitment from lenders would significantly mitigate the problem. Now, maybe not all lenders are in a financial position to do that, but I think a lot are. And I know that, Fannie and Freddie have already taken steps to try to ease the burden on non-bank servicers in terms of mortgage arrearages. And I think there are other possibilities. So I think the key thing is, first, try to get the best understanding you can of the scope of the problem and where it's most intense in the neighborhood. And secondly, try to identify those things that are manageable but that can have an impact, and really focus on doing that. Just one quick question, here a quick point on how do you measure a middle neighborhood? Essentially, there's no hard and fast definition, but when we talk about middle neighborhoods, what we're talking about is the neighborhoods, particularly in cities, but also in first-ring suburbs, places, which were the basic habitat of the working class and middle class, not wealthy, not poor, and which 60, 70 years ago represented the significant majority of all American urban and inner-ring suburban neighborhoods. Today, as our population is polarized, there are fewer of them, but there's still an awful lot. And if you think about a city, whether it be Detroit or Philadelphia or Cleveland or any of these places, they're the neighborhoods in between, the neighborhoods that are not the severely disinvested, abandoned neighborhoods. They're the neighborhoods that are not in that small group that may be gentrifying. They're the ones in between, and they very often, and I would say particularly those that are predominantly African American, are struggling economically. Okay, one quick question. Is there any hope at all? Yes. Human beings are resilient, and societies and economies are resilient. And I truly believe that we will survive and we will come out of this. I think what we have to do is think about, can we come out of this better than we went into this? Can we come out of this more prepared for the next pandemic, which is almost certainly going to happen? Can we come out of it more thoughtful about the nature of our society and economy and the inequalities and the imbalances that have led to these impacts being so much worse than they have to be, and the lack of the kind of safety net that would help us better manage these? Can we actually use this as an opportunity to start thinking about some of these issues as we go forward? So I believe there is hope, but it's going to be a hard slog. I believe, according to what the most recent information I have, and I don't claim to be an expert on this, but I have been told that there are ways CDBG CV can be used for rental assistance. I think it probably has to be fairly carefully crafted, but I believe that there are ways. So I think that's important. Also, I think especially for vulnerable families who are at risk of losing their houses and apartments, ESG can also be used for that. Okay, what areas of the country, it says county, but I assume you mean country, may see a harder impact on housing, such as the coasts versus Midwest? I think this is a reflection of a couple of things. First, which areas were doing better economically beforehand? And secondly, the extent to which different areas have been hit harder rather than less by the virus and are able to move out of quarantine relatively quickly, or have been in a less intense quarantine state over the past couple of months. So, I mean, certainly, just given the inherent imbalances, economic imbalances in our society and our economy, areas that are more prosperous, more wealthy, economically stronger, are going to do better. An awful lot of the Midwest, for example, was just playing catch up and was finally seeing significant growth, significant improvement after many years of national overall recovery. Their economic situation is going to be a lot more fragile than a state like California, for example, or Texas, where the economy is more robust. So that's going to be a clear factor. And again, and we don't know how this is going to play out because there's some evidence that the geographic spread of the coronavirus has not been finalized. In other words, it's still spreading out into areas which were relatively lightly affected up to this point. So we don't know how that's going to sort out. But certainly at the end of the day, some areas are going to be more impacted than others, and the ones that end up being less impacted are going to be able to recover faster than the more heavily impacted ones. This is, if my nonprofit was intending to start infill development work in middle neighborhoods, should we wait? Not knowing the specific neighborhood, the specific condition, and the regional economy and so forth, it's really hard to say. But one issue, of course, is whether this is a real, in the short run, whether this is necessarily going to be a good time to try to create additional supply in a local housing market. Now, some places that may not be a problem, but in other cases, if there's a significant risk of additional foreclosures, possible vacancy and abandonment, reduced home buying, at least for some period, then assuming that the infill development you're talking about is essentially dependent on market conditions, I think you may well want to just put the plans on hold, if you can do so without financial difficulty, for a year or so to see how the market trends in your area sort out. Because again, there are definitely going to be a lot of market weaknesses in a lot of market areas. Okay. I think which of the possible interventions would be a top priority or easiest to investigate and implement? Well, the short answer is all of them. But from a practical standpoint, I would focus initially at least a fair amount of my energy on the rental issue. I think it's it should be relatively easy to get some idea of what's going on, especially if a municipality or a CDC has relationships with landlords and can reach out to them and get some idea from them of what's happening. And again, it's not a solution, but the amount of dollars that are needed to make some difference is likely to be manageable. I think the second, there's not a great deal, especially in the short run, that a municipality or any kind of a organization can do about the massive unemployment challenge, which is clearly the underpinning of a lot of the other problems. So that's something that, unfortunately, you're just going to have to, I think, in neighborhood level work, accept as a given and try to work with. So I think rental housing is a big issue to the extent that either through the municipality, through the state, however, one can get access to talk to people, responsible people in lending institutions, trying to come up with some foreclosure mitigation steps, like, again, not making the payments due at once, but tacking them onto the back of the mortgage. Could be enough, again, depending on the access, could be a valuable short-term strategy. I think, and there's some other questions I've seen here about supporting small businesses. I think this is really tough, because I think one of the big questions is, small businesses in urban neighborhoods outside of the very upscale areas and tourist or downtown areas tend to be highly insecure operations as often as not. And so figuring out how to help stabilize them is going to be difficult. But I think one thing could be useful is to reach out to the small businesses or the small business owners or operators, because the businesses themselves are likely to be closed, but to try to identify who they are and talk to them and basically say, what do you need in order to be able, or reasonably confident that you'll be able to reopen? And then try to figure out, and this is something I think that's very important for local economic development agencies in particular to be doing, is find out what these companies need, really do some very aggressive outreach, and then try to figure out what tools might be available. Do they need just relief on their mortgages or on taxes or rent or working capital to gear back up and rebuild inventory, or, and really develop a small business support system that's typically much more robust than the typical small business support system that communities operate. And I think most cities have something they can build on. They do have some form of small business support system. They have relationships with small businesses. So I think this is the time to really ramp that up and see how they can create a support system that can help stabilize and reopen as many as possible of the small businesses. Now, ultimately, once they've reopened, some of them, again, depending on how the new normal is going to emerge, it's not over just because they reopened. It's going to be a struggle for a year, 2, 3, and 4. And ultimately, in the final analysis, a business has to be able to generate enough activity, enough people buying their food, buying their products, sitting at their tables, and so forth, if it's going to survive. So what third parties can do to make that happen is constrained, but to the extent that there are things to do, this is the time to start planning them and to start doing the outreach so you'll be ready with the assistance, hopefully, when the time comes. Let's see. Who should be in the room when the recovery planning begins? I have ideas for the structure of that planning effort. Okay, the first question is, the short answer to that is everybody. And that's, at one level, that's obvious. Of course they should. At another level, that's not so obvious, because I think an awful lot of people who have a particular focus tend to be dismissive of people who don't, or who they see as the adversary or the other. And I'll give you one example. I have been quite dismayed by the calls of some housing advocates for a kind of a blanket 4-month or 6-month or whatever suspension of rents without any consideration that landlords need that money to pay their mortgages, taxes, utilities, maintenance, and so forth, and support themselves from the rents. And that, I think, that kind of tunnel vision, I think, is very problematic. Tenants need relief, but it has to be with an understanding that landlords and tenants are, in the final analysis, part of an interdependent system. And small business people need help, but they will benefit to the extent that people in the neighborhood patronize them and see them as part of the neighborhood and feel that what they're doing as small businesses benefits the neighborhood. So I think everybody has to sit down together, landlords, tenants. If you can get lenders at the table, I think that's important. Unfortunately, unlike most, not all, but most landlords, they tend not to be local. Small business people and their organizations. Government, obviously. I think it's going to be very important, if at all possible, is to get people from state government to be participating in what's going on at the city level, because they have tools, they have resources, they're part of the solution. I think a lot of issues, may require, some things may require either executive orders or state legislation to address fully. So I think it's really important to get all of the key people, because this is a whole interrelated set of issues. I think just on a more narrowly technical level, I think it's important to get an awful lot of different people involved in the process of how do you get data? How do you get good information? So, for example, in one city where I've talked to people, they would love to have data on unemployment locally, which is not something that's routinely tracked. But if one can get the Department of Labor, for example, which has all of this data in their database, to provide municipalities with data on the number of unemployment claims, say by zip code or even better by census tract, that then the local officials and the CDCs can match against the size of the workforce and so forth in this census tract to get a sense of where the hardest hit areas are likely to be. That would be a plus. So I think the same thing is for, say, county recorders or the equivalent, to provide users with real-time data on real estate transactions. So all of these are some of the things. But the key thing is that this is a real classic, in the words of the cliche, all hands on deck issue. And I think it's really what it's going to take. Okay. I think that there are a lot of great questions here. I know we're getting near the end. Let me see if I can try one or two. Is there an opportunity to develop a toolkit for some of the solutions being discussed? I hope so, and I think this is something that we at Community Progress and a lot of other people really need to be working on over the next few months. One of the things that makes this so difficult is, you know, we're in the middle of a fast-moving river where things are changing constantly and the uncertainties are enormous. And it's very difficult to develop a toolkit for something that you don't really know its parameters yet. But I think we've got to start trying and at least start trying to disseminate as many different ideas worth testing. I mean, it's sort of like currently there are, I don't know how many hundreds of labs around the world that are trying to develop a vaccine. Now, to a large extent, we and they don't know everything that they ought to know before doing it, but it's urgent, and so they're trying all kinds of things. And I think we're in a similar situation. We have to try things, even though we don't know quite yet what's going to work best. So I think there is an opportunity, and I'm certainly, you know, at Community Progress, you know, we're working on this issue and are hopefully going to come up with things that are very useful for folks. Okay, here's a question. Can you speak to VPROs, vacant property registration ordinances, and whether they may be helpful if we start to see both residential and commercial foreclosures? I think absolutely. I think a municipality that has an effective vacant property registry, which means effective meaning they actually do have their properties registered as distinct from simply having a paper ordinance, is in a good position to get ahead of the game. A municipality that can get access to data on foreclosures in real time is definitely going to be in a good position. And this goes back to some of the issues that were very big 10 years ago when we were seeing a wave of foreclosures, making sure that when a property is foreclosed or is in foreclosure and is vacated by the owner, that they identify the lender and hold the lender accountable, I think is another big issue. So I think in many respects, the better the municipality was at laying the groundwork for dealing with vacant properties before the crisis, the better they're going to be able to deal with what's coming down the pike. So I see it's 1:02 already, and I think I had better give it back to Justin. One thing I will try to do is over the course of the next week, Justin and I will get together, print out the questions that were not answered, and to the best of my ability, I will try to provide written answers, which will then be hopefully transmitted to the people who've been on the call. So again, I thank you, and I look forward to working with you over the coming months.
All right. Thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. Thank you again to Alan for a great presentation. We hope that you all will join us on May 7th for our next COVID-19 focused Cornerstone webinar that'll be focused on the federal response. In the meantime, please visit our website for more information on this and other upcoming webinars, and have a great afternoon.